Development of pharyngeal arch, pouch and cleft of human embryo was detailed in last class. The major development of facial region occurs between 4th and 8th week via a series of highly coordinated and pre-programmed events. According to Professor William Hiss, face is derived from 5 processes or prominences surrounding the invaginating oral cavity or stomodium. They are frontonasal process, paired maxillary process and paired mandibular process, which grow, meet and fuse. So now you know that this maxillary and the mandibular processes are part of first pharyngeal arch. Only the first pharyngeal arch contribute to the development of face and no other arches participate in the formation of face. Okay. So between 4th and 5th week of embryonic development, the oropharyngeal membrane disintegrate and create a communication between the foregut and outside. So in this diagram you can see the stomodium is now surrounded by frontonasal process above, the paired maxillary process on either side and also paired mandibular process below. And later this mandibular process develop into lower jaw. And lower jaw is the first part of face to form and result from merging of the medial end of mandibular process by late 4th week. Okay. The lower jaw is the first part of face to form and this result from merging of the medial end of the mandibular process by late 4th week. So again you have to remember that the face is formed by the fusion of frontonasal process, maxillary process and mandibular process, and only the first arch is participating in the development of face. And next is nasal placard. Nasal placard is actually an ectodermal thickening on either side of the frontonasal process, and actually the neural crest cells proliferate and form the nasal placards. Later this nasal placard will invaginate to form the nasal pit and they are the precursors to the nasal cavity. And as each nasal pit begin to sink below the surface as nasal groove in early 5th week, first they develop lateral nasal process and then the medial nasal process, and together they form a downward facing horseshoe with open end facing the stomodium. By late 5th week, these pits continue to deepen actively and they go back into the stomodium forming the nasal sac. So nasal placard to nasal pit, then the lateral nasal process and the medial nasal process. In this you can see that the medial nasal process is more prominent than the lateral nasal process, and enlarged caudal end of each medial nasal process is called the globular process of Hiss, and from this develop philtrum and the upper lip. So globular process of Hiss to philtrum and upper lip. Okay. And this is a sagittal section, and in this you can see that the nasal sac is separated from the oral cavity by the oronasal membrane, and this membrane eventually rupture and create an opening between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, and failure of the rupturing of the oronasal membrane will result in choanal atresia, which was already described. And then by 6th to 7th week of embryonic development, this maxillary process will grow medially, and medially there are two processes, as you know, that is a medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process. So this maxillary process will fuse with the lateral nasal process and they form the nasolacrimal groove. Okay, it's a nasolacrimal groove, that is a site where the cheek and the lateral nasal territory merge, and at the base of this groove a rod-like ectodermal development forming an epithelial cord which canalizes to form the nasolacrimal duct and the nasolacrimal sac. Okay. And the maxillary process fuse with the process will expand medially and they merge with the medial nasal process and they form the intermaxillary segment. That is the premaxilla, the gingival lining, the primary palate and the upper lip arise from the intermaxillary segment. Okay. So From the maxillary process, develop the lateral part of upper lip, most of the maxillary and secondary palate. The orofacial cleft occurs when this process fails to fuse properly. And between 6th and 8th week of embryonic development, the palate begins to develop. And this causes a distinction between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, and the development of phase is completed by 12th week. Okay, so you have to remember that the development of phase is mainly from frontonasal process, maxillary process, and the mandibular process. The mandibular process on either side fuse in the midline and they form the lower jaw. And the frontonasal process, mainly the forehead and the dorsum of nose, and maxillary process, they fuse with the opposite side and also with the medial nasal process, forming the intermaxillary segment, and also on the lateral side they form the cheek, and later between 6th and 8th week the development of palate starts. Okay, so this is development of face in short.